Coming up, Brexit has failed. Those were the words this week of the Brexitist-in-Chief, the architect and totem of the Brexit vote, Nigel Farage. The former UKIP leader was responding after BBC Newsnight presenter Victoria Derbyshire listed the mounting evidence that quitting the European Union has damaged the British economy. A poll from last month showed that 53% of people say it was wrong to Brexit. Around 1 in 5 Leave voters regret it. While in fact there have been many polls dutifully tracked by a statista in this chart. And against this 53% saying it was wrong to Brexit, there are only 33% that still think it was right. That's actually 2 in 5 Leave voters who appear to now regret it. The OBR, Office for Budget Responsibility, forecast a 4% hit to the economy over the medium to long term. That's £40 billion in tax revenues. The UK economy is the only G7 economy not back to its pre-pandemic size. Business investment has lagged behind comparable economies. Here's a short clip from this interview showing Farage's response to these points.
We haven't actually benefited from Brexit economically, well, we could have done. I mean, what Brexit's proved, I'm afraid, is that our politicians are about as useless as the commissioners in Brussels were. We've mismanaged this totally. Brexit has failed.
As with all zealots and ideologues, when their big idea actually gets put into practice and turns out to be a disaster, they never blame the idea itself. It's always the fault of either the way it was implemented or on the people implementing it. Stay tuned. I'd really appreciate it if you'd hit the like button, subscribe, and above all, share a link to this video with your social media contacts. Over the last year, British politics has been completely insane. Boris Johnson eventually brought down by a sex scandal, rapidly followed by the crazy Kwarteng budget and the subsequent downfall of the ludicrous Liz Truss. And now, to top it all, Mr. Brexit himself, Nigel Farage, bluntly admits that Brexit has failed. This is the very same charlatan who once promised to emigrate should such an event come to pass. To quote him from his own talk radio show on LBC 6 years ago, he told caller Tony,
"If Brexit is a disaster, I will go and live abroad. I'll go and live somewhere else."
He added, "It isn't going to be a disaster. We've just managed to get ourselves in a lifeboat off the Titanic." In the real world, in 2023, the good ship EU continues cruising along, unencumbered by the dragging anchor of an always difficult member off its northern coast, and with no iceberg in sight. Meanwhile, the sovereign post-Brexit nation of the disunited kingdom is not so much a lifeboat as a very leaky dinghy. And talking of leaky dinghies, Brexit has turned out to be a primary cause of desperate refugees taking to small boats to cross the Channel, knowing that Brexit Britain is no longer able to return them to the first EU country of entry, which we could under the terms of the Dublin Agreement before Brexit. That Dublin Agreement became null and void under the implementation of the Brexit Withdrawal Agreement, and was always going to lead to an increase in migrants taking unconventional routes to enter the UK. But don't worry, as the Brexitists often assure us that they knew exactly what they were voting for. Brexit has not just led to an increase in immigration, it's led also to rising corporation tax and additional business regulations. One example that's close to my heart, having spent 20 years in the video games industry in the UK and America, is this example of the post-Brexit UK blocking the takeover of one of the world's leading video games companies, Activision Blizzard, by Microsoft. The EU had previously allowed the takeover that post-Brexit Britain has blocked. Activision Blizzard subsequently declared the UK's decision a disservice to UK citizens who face increasingly dire economic prospects. "We will reassess our growth plans for the UK. Global innovators, large and small, will take note that, despite all its rhetoric, the UK is clearly closed for business." With Microsoft saying that the decision discourages technology innovation and investment in the UK. But for Farage, this is not proof of the inevitable failure of the idea of Brexit. Oh no. In his mind, it's proof that
our politicians are about as useless as the commissioners in Brussels were. We've mismanaged this totally.
So, though I really enjoyed hearing Farage say that
Brexit has failed,
the truth is that this wasn't some big mea culpa, I'm guilty, some admission that the grand idea of Brexit that he's championed for a decade or more is flawed. Oh no, it's his attempt to rewrite the narrative, to present this disastrous Brexit as being all the fault of his arch enemies, the Conservative Party, for not delivering the Brexit that he had championed. Farage's comments were not in fact at all surprising. Admitting Brexit has been a disaster is not the same thing at all as admitting he got it wrong. Because, in his mind, it's all the fault of the Tories, or the Remainers, or the Blob, that apparently secret group of lefty lawyers, civil servants and the deep state that has somehow frustrated the implementation of Farage's pure Brexit. It's interesting, isn't it, that after the terrible local election results for our extreme right-wing Tory government, the message that they seem to have taken from those results is that they're not right-wing enough and should move even further to the right, pandering to the Bravermans and the Rees-Moggs, the Redwoods and the Neanderthals. In the same way, when the Brexitists look at the catastrophic hard Brexit that we ended up with, they claim that the catastrophe was caused by the Brexit not being hard enough. The leaders of both these cults must be extremely hard of thinking. And talking of the worse than expected Tory result in those recent local elections, the one bright spot amid the Tory doom and gloom was the almost total failure of the Reform Party, the successor to Farage's Brexit Party. It stood 480 candidates and got just 6 elected. The original UKIP party were totally wiped out in the council elections, having had 500 councillors as recently as 2016 and ending up with 0. But still, the unelected Farage is given airtime on GBBs and the BBC and retains an increasingly gullible personal following. He told Victoria Derbyshire during the Newsnight interview that he wouldn't rule out making a return to frontline politics. Presumably, that would see him return to the bosom of his friend Richard Tice and take over leadership of the Reform Party, who vow to take on the Tories at the next general election, potentially splitting the right-wing vote as they vie for who can have the most inhumane and despicable policies on immigration. Meanwhile, beyond Farage and the other charlatan cult leaders, for many Leave voters, the raw facts of economic life are becoming difficult to argue against. 2 in every 5 Leave voters now regret their choice. Regretters, if you like. The independent Office for Budget Responsibilities forecast of a 4% hit to UK growth has come true. In fact, it's set to be closer to 5.5%. And trade activity is down 17% since the Brexit, which means reduced competition, which in turn has stoked inflation. And the Bank of England estimates £29 billion of business investment has been lost directly due to Brexit. But, for the sake of balance, it's only fair to list the benefits of Brexit. Unfortunately, so far, there are none. Not for the UK, that is. Plenty for the EU, now that they've cut the anchor free and have benefited from the investment that the UK has lost, with many Asian and American companies choosing countries within the EU for their investments, rather than the rather riskier prospect of investing in a post-Brexit isolated UK. And who can blame them? Yeah, say the inhabitants of Idiot's Corner, who post their illiterate sovereignty in it, unelected bureaucrats, traitorous Remoaners, and your pro-EU bias, who can't get over it and accept the will of the people. Why don't you just go and live in the EU if you love it so much? Ah, the irony. But even the leading Brexiteer newspaper, the Daily Telegraph, proclaimed recently that Brexit is finally dead. Their assistant comment editor, Sherelle Jacobs, said the last speck of sand in the hourglass fell for Brexit after senior figures representing both the Conservatives and Labour recently met to discuss the shortcomings of the Brexit project at Ditchley Park. She added, "The exchange dwelled heavily on the fact that Brexit is not delivering," adding that there was broad support for a closer relationship with the EU. Personally, I don't think Brexit is dead, at least for as long as Starmer's Labour Party and even the Liberal Democrats pretend that they can make Brexit work. But in the real world, the Brexit project has been a failure, with all the major claims by the Brexitist cult leaders proving to be as empty as their heads. Where is the revived fishing industry, for example? Where is that uptick in agriculture that farmers were promised? Both industries have, on the contrary, been victims of the Brexit. Where are the billions of pounds that were meant to be saved by leaving the EU and which were promised to expand the NHS? Where is the cheaper food from day one? The cheaper fuel, the cheaper energy, the lower immigration figures? The experts unanimously told us that these promises were just unicorns, that they were, if anything, the opposite of the truth. But of course, Leave voters, in the words of Michael Gove, had had enough of experts. Remain voters sided with the experts and against the tin-pot Little Englanders with their wishful thinking mixed with a belief in British exceptionalism and jingoism. And surprise, surprise, 7 years after the fateful referendum, and UK economic growth and wages are squeezed more than ever. The promised revival of rundown high streets has turned out to be a joke. They're more rundown now than they ever were. And all the post-Brexit promises of levelling up have seen funds diverted from deprived Labour voting areas to the relatively wealthy blue wall constituencies and selected marginal seats in the north.
I managed to start changing the funding formulas to make sure that areas like this are getting the funding that they deserve. Because we inherited a bunch of formulas from the Labour Party that shoved all the funding into deprived urban areas, then that needed to be undone.
There's a growing shortage of skilled, secure, well-paid jobs, alongside a broken NHS that just seems to be on its knees, with the loss of thousands of EU workers who have returned home, not wanting to put up with the hostile environment since Brexit. On top of all that, there's a housing crisis, with the Housing Secretary, Michael Gove, admitting this week that it is increasingly difficult to get on the property ladder due to the dire shortage of affordable housing. Keir Starmer and Labour should stop talking about making Brexit work and instead start promising to tackle the root causes of the Leave vote. Journalist Ash Sarkar recently likened the Brexit vote to being the owner of a television that was on the blink and giving it a good hard smack on the top to try and fix it. They thought a Leave vote would fix problems that in reality weren't caused by being members of the EU, but rather by 6 years of austerity under a Cameron government. It was never going to be a solution to the UK's problems. I want the Labour Party to offer an alternative to bashing the top of the TV, which would look something like this. A radical programme reversing years of austerity by properly funding public services. Raising the tax rate on unearned income to be in line with earned income, and raising personal tax allowances. They also need to return to traditional Labour values and bring the privatised essential services such as water, energy and transport back into public ownership and stop those billions of pounds of public funds ending up as dividends in the pockets of overseas investors who don't give a toss about service levels and the quality of life for those of us residing in the UK, and instead diverting those profits into investing in the future of those utilities for the benefit of us all. At the same time as the causes of the Brexit vote are removed, we would also as a nation accelerate the move back towards a closer and more cooperative relationship with the EU, removing unnecessary non-tariff barriers and rejoining Erasmus, Horizon and other such European schemes as the first steps towards reapplying for membership towards the end of this decade. It's clear which way the wind is now blowing. But the very first step is to rid ourselves of this current government, headed by a man who has always been an integral supporter of the Brexit project and who shares responsibility for bringing the disaster of Brexit to our doors. Only after ridding ourselves of this Brexit continuation government can we make any meaningful progress in fundamentally changing our current relationship with the EU to our mutual benefit and increase the chances of a future application to rejoin being successful.
Welcome to the Brexit, sir. I'm sorry.
Oh my God.